Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the Iowa City Public Library. This is an event of Eco Iowa City, a grant between the Iowa City Public Library and the City of Iowa City's, particularly Public Works Department, and particularly within the Public Works Department, the Landfill Department. Jen Jordan, who is the co-director of the grant, is here, and this is one of our many events for what we've renamed April to Earth Month, because this is the 40th anniversary of Earth Day, April 22nd, and we're very excited to have this program here at the library. So I am going to turn it over to Connie, and thank you again for coming.
Thank you for coming on this absolutely gorgeous day. I'm amazed that anybody can not just kind of seep through the window to that weather outside. My name's Connie Mutel. I edited the book. It was a real privilege to work with all of the authors that contributed their chapters and with the designers and others. I have always been a student of nature. I think that I've always, from the time I was young, really felt perhaps more akin to other species than to people. That's an embarrassing thing to admit, but my sister's a social worker, so together we kind of balance each other out. And I realized that this was supposed to be a reading, so I'm going to do a little bit of reading. I'll talk for 10 minutes, then we'll have 3 other authors who will speak for 10 minutes each, and then we'll have time for questions. Nature speaks to us in many ways. We watch, listen, and try to understand. Songbirds returning in the spring tell of homecoming and new life. Whales sing of ocean swells and planetary migrations. Some voices, like those of Arctic mammals swimming toward melting ice floes, speak of a planet where conditions seem to be changing too rapidly for their own good and for ours. Midwesterners may think that they hear similar suggestions of Earth's processes out of kilter when spring rainstorms thunder over the Midwest, storms that waken memories of previous years when water rose too fast and spread too far. This happened in eastern Iowa in June of 2008. That's the first paragraph in the book, and I thought a lot about how each of us probably perceived the flood in our own way and responded to the flood in our own way. I'm a words person. I enjoy working with words and with ideas, and so my response was quite naturally to start to put together a book under a little bit of prodding from some other people, whom I won't name. The book just came out. It's Watershed Year, The Anatomy of the Iowa Floods of 2008. It's really a product that I hope is going to be educational in a broad way. It was meant to be a translation of science and facts for lay audiences. It's supposed to be a nuts and bolts book, a book about what happened with the floods, why did they occur, what processes contributed to making them bigger or smaller. How can we interpret the terms of the floods as well as the processes of the floods? And it's supposed to be also a tool, kind of a toolbox for people like land managers, administrators, policymakers, and the like. The book focuses on Johnson and Linn counties, the counties that were hit the hardest with the floods, and on the Cedar and Iowa River watersheds, again, the watersheds that were hit the hardest. But in reality, it could have been written and sold as a book about flooding in the Corn Belt, because that's what it talks about. What happens when you have intense rains on an area that has been converted mostly to corn and soybeans and that has relatively flat topography and a lot of thick soil. That's what the book talks about, that's what it interprets, and it talks about how to prevent those floods as well. Well, no, I shouldn't say that because we can't prevent them, but how to moderate their damage. There are 25 chapters in the book. So it's quite a diversity of information. These chapters were written by 30 authors, all of them experts in their fields, all of them Iowans except one. The chapters are short. They're intended to be, again, for the lay public, and because they're short, and with that shortness, I tried to make them easy to understand, kind of at a similar level, so that anyone reading the chapters could work with them. Any fairly well-educated person, 6th grade and up, let's say, maybe a little bit higher, I don't know. Before I proceed, I'd like to give thanks to my home institution, IAHR Hydroscience and Engineering, and also to the Global Change Institute on campus, CGRIR, or the Center for Global and Regional Environmental Research, for funding the book as well as the graphics. They helped pay my salary while I was working on the book. So whenever you start a project like this, you have to have a little bit of courage. I remember once when my husband and I were traveling down, I think it was in Belize, and I wrote an essay about this because it struck me so strongly, an essay about standing up on a cliff, and my sons and husband were down in the water below, and of course they had dragged me up this cliff, and then they were saying, "Come on, Mom, jump, 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 jump." And I stood there until I literally fried off of that cliff. I had a horrible sunburn because I was too afraid to jump off of the cliff into the river down below. And starting a book like this is a little bit like that. You're trying to get the courage to jump into something that you know very little about. And I work with hydrologists, people that work with water, but I didn't know very much about flooding. So I learned certainly as much as anyone in this room will learn if he or she reads the book. And I think one of the most important things that I learned was to question something that I think is pretty strong among human beings, which is pride. And pride leads to a sense of control, or a feeling that we do have control over nature. And what I learned, first of all, from talking to one of our speakers here, Professor Krajewski, and others at my home institution, was that floods are natural processes. They're going to happen. There's nothing you can do to stop them. You might make them a little bit smaller, but they are as natural as the sun rising and falling. Rising and setting. We hope it doesn't fall. Rivers are marked by constant change. They continually erode and deposit sediment, reshaping and resizing their channels in the process. Rivers work to achieve an equilibrium that keeps water in the main channel of the river, but sometimes the water flowing into the river exceeds the river channel's capacity, and more room is needed. The floodplain is part of the extended river channel, standing by to carry and store water when it becomes necessary, with sections that are lowest and most easily connected to the river flooding first and most frequently. Floodplains are thus necessary parts of all properly functioning rivers, even though they are not constantly occupied by water. Seen in this way, the excessive river flow that we define as a flood is not abnormal. It is as natural as the rising of the sun, and no more easily prevented than the earth's cycling around the sun. Floods are what rivers do. Floods are one component of the water cycle, a process as ancient and necessary as any of nature's cycles. Floods become a problem only because we choose to live and place objects of value in a river's extended channel, that is, in the floodplain. So I think that if we start to think a little bit more about nature's processes and realize that although, especially in this country, we are not in control of them, but they're still in control of our lives, we would have maybe a little bit better approach to floods. And I learned this, but I learned a lot of other things which are reflected in the 25 chapters. These chapters are divided into 4 sections. The first 2 chapters talk about basic traits of floods and the causes of floods, and our 3 speakers are 3 people who wrote chapters in those sections. Section 3 talks about the effects of floods on communities and farmland, the economy, nature, and air and water. And Section 4 talks about what we do next. This is the most important section. We don't have any speakers talking about this today, unfortunately. But this section, Wayne says he's going to talk a little bit about it, but this section talks about things like the 100-year floodplain and how we have to size ourselves at a much, not at the 100-year floodplain, but at a much different level, about watershed-wide planning, about levees, and about changing the landscape to make it more resilient. And it talks about the idea of being proactive and not reactive. I think that one of the things that struck me when I finished this book, finished putting all these chapters together, you do have a few aha moments along the way, and usually very late at night when you're not sure if they're real or if they're kind of some foggy mystery out there presenting itself. But what I realized is that that what we do, what our human nature calls us to do, is to try over and over to return to business as usual. Business as usual is our comfort zone, right? It's going home today and taking a shower and maybe going for a walk and having a milkshake if we like milkshakes. That's what we like to do. But if we've just had a heart attack or something like that, maybe we're not going to have a milkshake, and we have to change our patterns. And we need to teach ourselves to be a little bit more proactive in our thinking in order to prevent the problems. And that means kicking ourselves out of this business as usual comfort zone. That's something that I hope the floods will teach us. I heard a talk just this last Monday by David Orr on climate change on campus. Did anybody else go to that? It was pretty depressing, but it was it was awfully depressing. But I liked a lot of things that he said, and one of the things that he said is that nobody chooses to live in one of our greatest generations, right? I mean, the World War II people who fought in World War II, those people are supposed to be our greatest generation. He said they wouldn't have chosen to be in the situation where they had to go off and fight Hitler. But once they were forced into that situation, they rose to heights that they wouldn't have risen to otherwise. And I really like that. I think that the floods are maybe pushing us into being a great generation on this earth, into leaving our comfort zone and trying new solutions that will, again, lessen damage, not to ourselves necessarily, but certainly to future generations. And I will close with the last paragraph in the book. Iowa's 2008 floods were not caused by human activity. With the tremendous quantities of water gushing down our waterways, floods were sure to come. But they were giving us a message about the sustainability of our landscape, just as the 1993 floods did. Will we listen to the message? The Iowa and Cedar River watersheds are the subject of abundant flood research. Might they also become demonstration sites for new approaches to flood mitigation, blending economic and environmental health in ways that later could be emulated throughout the region? Could Iowa, in the heart of the Corn Belt, become a model for lessening water's negative power by tying agricultural practices to their water consequences? The next time floods strike, might we look with pride at a healthy and resilient landscape, wise planning, and well-thought-out mitigation strategies that reduced the flood damages? If we act wisely, the 2008 floods will be viewed not as an endpoint or a time of loss, but rather as a new beginning, stimulated by challenges and possibilities. We have things to do. Let's get busy. So we will get busy here by listening to our three other speakers. And the first speaker is Professor Vitek Krajewski. He's again at the Iowa Institute of, IAHR Hydroscience and Engineering. He's a professor of civil and environmental engineering and a research engineer at IAHR. And he's also the director of the state-funded Iowa Flood Center, which was formed partially in response to the 2008 floods. And we just heard this last week that this flood center is renewed for the coming year and also has some very new jobs, exciting jobs to tackle. So, Professor Krajewski.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Connie, for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to contribute to the book. This was an exciting and a difficult project. And let me tell you, Connie is a tough editor. Well, my co-author, Ricardo Mantilla, just walked in. He's back there. And let's see. Okay. As I'm. Oops, that's not mine. Yeah, as I'm getting ready to share with you just one particular aspect from the chapter. This morning, Ricardo and I, we played soccer in the morning, and we were discussing, this event. It's good to have a co-author, because you can then divide, the credit and the blame. So the credit goes to Ricardo, I'll take the blame. On the soccer field, I'm happy to switch those. Ricardo came to Iowa in the winter of 2008, and his PhD from the University of Colorado was on a theory of floods, and we have been working with his advisor, there for a number of years, and then the flood, came, and so then I challenged Ricardo. I said, okay, look, let's try to take this theory and see if it can deal with a real flood. And so we were evacuated from our building. So we worked in the basement of my house and tested the patience of my wife, Diana, who is in the back. But that's where the core of the development that I'm going to talk to you about happened. So I will try to provide a partial answer to this question. Why were these floods so large? So just to remind everybody, I'm going to talk about that blue watershed, which is the watershed that drains the water upstream from Cedar Rapids. We have done analysis for other watersheds, including the Iowa River, but the focus will be on the blue part. So you see the main, rivers, there, and you see this blue area extending all the way to Minnesota. And it covers about 6,500 square miles, so that's about 17,000 square kilometers. So it's a, good size real estate. Well, so the conventional wisdom about floods is, there was just, too much rain, and, when you have too much rain, then you have flooding. So that's all there is to it, really. Well, and especially when you also have a lot of snow, and then the snow has to melt, so it's just, too much water out there. So why would they study this? Well, there is actually more to it. So, but I will walk you through that, conventional picture. So this is a timeline with some of the key, parameters. So yes, the winter, lots of snow. At some point that in March, actually, 2 years ago, that snow started, melting. And so you see a plot here of the air temperature. So, the yellow is the highs during the days, and the blues are, the highs, the lows during the night. And you see that in April, pretty much we don't go below, freezing, or at least in that year. So all that snow, was melting. Well, so that's the snow melt part of the story. So how did that translate into runoff? So there's another timeline here that shows in the upper panel the precipitation, again including the winter precipitation with the snow and the snow melt that I was showing you. And then, if you recall, there were actually big storms, spring storms in April. But now take a look at the bottom, plot, and the red line shows the water levels in the river here in Cedar Rapids that we call normal. So what is that normal? That normal is the average over many, many years, let's say 100 years, for a given day. So if you average all those days, like April 20th or something, over many years, well, then that's what you expect on April 20th. So when you look at this, you see that that snowmelt, yes, it actually resulted in some minor flooding. Again, flood is not necessarily a level above normal, but loosely we can think of it, that way. Well, so flooding is water outside of the banks, and what determines the level of the banks, well, that's a different, story for another day. But so we had a peak in runoff and discharge resulting from the snowmelt, but then the rivers came back to normal. Okay. Well, then we had these spring storms, intensive, storms. So you can see that, quite a few storms, left a few inches of rain on the ground, and again that resulted in some significantly above normal levels of water in the rivers. But then again the rivers came back to normal, and then the big one, came. But even when you look at, this, yes, the rainfalls were, intensive, here, right before that flood. But actually, and I'm not going to make the case for this, here, but it's in the book, the storms by themselves were not extraordinary. They were intensive, granted, and they were, high, and there was a lot of water. But nothing that would be commensurate with that extraordinary level of the flood. You can't hear me?
The television people can't hear you. So
wow.
No.
Okay.
If you just,
all right.
There you go.
Okay. So anyway, so then the storms, came, and somehow look at, this level of water in this case, again, Cedar River at Cedar Rapids. So what happened, there? So how come the storms that by themselves were not, I call them here extraordinary, and I'm reserving, the term for something very, very unusual, resulted in something that was, highly unusual. So here is the story. And again, this is just one aspect of what happened. So this is now a map of the same, basin. So the Iowa River basin upstream from Marengo is just for company. But the analysis is for the Cedar River. So now we are showing here the travel times. So how much does it take for water that ends up in a small stream somewhere in Minnesota? How much time it takes that water to flow all the way to Cedar Rapids? So you can see that from Minnesota it takes about 8 days, and then from these areas about 7 days and 6 days, and so on. Okay, so if there was a storm in Minnesota, then 8 days later, that water is gone. Okay, as far as Cedar Rapids is concerned. So just keep this image in mind, because now it's important to superimpose on this the rainfall. So now this is what happened with the rainfall. So this is now I think it's about a 10-day accumulation of rainfall over the same area. And you can see that that rainfall was not evenly distributed. It was distributed in these, these bands, because those were the tracks of the storms that happened on different, days during this period. But during this about 10-day period, this area up here, received, so what is this in inches? So divided by 25, and you have it in inches. So quite a few. Well, and then, and so on. So you can see that even though the entire basin got some rainfall, but there were some places that, didn't receive, a lot. Still, 2 inches or 4 inches, that's still a lot of, rain, even over a 10-day period. But there were areas that received, much more. So now to understand what happened to that, rainwater, let's try to follow it down, that river. So here is a day-by-day picture of the same, rainfall. And so now I will just right away say that the peak of the flood at Cedar Rapids was here on June 13th. Okay, so now look at this. So here, so this is an inch now, 2 inches, 3 inches. So now this is nice. Yeah. So not that much water, here, and some storms and kind of widespread. Well, but look at this. So June 8th. So again, this was northern Iowa, so not that much in Minnesota. Northern Iowa, a lot of water, 6 inches, of rainfall in one day. So then let's just count how many days it takes for that water to get, to Cedar Rapids. So from that area, if you remember, it was about, 5, 6, days. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the peak of the flood wave, due to this intensive, storm, would be on the 13th in Cedar Rapids. But now look at this. This happened just one day before that peak. So what happened there was that there was a traffic jam in the drainage network, in the river drainage network. And so that's that one aspect that I wanted, to share, with you here. So yes, so there was the ground was, saturated with the snow melt, and it was a rather, cool spring. So, and because it was wet, they delayed, planting of crops. So there wasn't much vegetation in May and even into June. In the fields, and there were intensive, storms, but again, by themselves, not extraordinary. And then there was this traffic jam in the river network. And now, you may also remember that the prediction of this flood in Cedar Rapids was rather poor. So people were caught by surprise, and that's why there was a lot of damage, because they couldn't even remove all the belongings from all those office buildings downtown Cedar Rapids, because there was no time. They didn't get enough warning. So why is that? Well, the scientific skills that would be required to make that prediction correct would be to tell more about this storm in advance. So at least the Weather Service would have to predict the occurrence of the storm with respect to timing, so when and where and how much. And only with that information we then stood a chance to make a good forecast of what would happen in Cedar Rapids. Well, those skills are just not there. Okay, we just cannot tell that far in advance about rainfall. It's a very difficult environmental variable, to predict. So that's that much about this concept. I will wrap it up now quickly. So if you now take that flood and the rainfall and kind of split it, this is our estimated what would have happened if it was not for that last day of rainfall. So and this is roughly to scale. So this peak corresponds to this picture. We remember. So this level here corresponds to this picture. So this peak without that one storm, yeah, the water would be higher, but hopefully under the bridge, not over the bridge. But to be able to make this analysis, now you have to have a good, information about rainfall, and we do have this from the weather radars, and that's what I was showing you here. then you have to have a good, depiction of the drainage network. So you have to have a faithful representation of the drainage network, all the way from small streams, to larger streams, to small rivers, and to large rivers. If you butcher this representation of the drainage network, then your prediction will not be, that good. So those are the elements of the model, all the way. This is the last slide that shows the correspondence of the model, derived drainage network, and the landscape, and you can see that the correspondence is pretty good, and it is that level of detail that is required to simulate water transport in the landscape, correctly. And so this is the kind of modeling approach that the Flood Center is working on, and this is not quite, the same as what the National Weather Service uses in the operational, forecasting. So with this, I would like to thank you, and later on, I'll be happy to answer any questions. So thank you very much.
Okay. I think we're privileged to have this exciting research being done right here, right in the building that was flooded 2 years ago. So our next speaker is Wayne Petersen. Wayne has worked in soil and water conservation for 33 years, a third of a century. He established urban water conservation as a field, as a discipline here in Iowa. He now directs the urban water conservation program for the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship. Wayne said that he thought he had 20 minutes because he wrote 2 chapters from the book, but no, Wayne. No, 10 minutes, please. So we have time for questions. Thank you.
Okay, so in the first chapter, I talk about the hydrologic cycle. Most people have been exposed to it. Bring this up here. Water evaporates, it moves through the atmosphere, it comes down to the earth again. And what we're really interested in is, well, how does it move once it comes out of the atmosphere? And today, especially on our urban landscapes, this is a pretty big component of the hydrologic cycle. Historically, I've come to believe that probably was not a major component, that this is what was going on, that most rainfall was held and absorbed and infiltrated, and that groundwater was the major driver of the terrestrial component of the hydrologic cycle, and that our wetlands and rivers and streams and lakes were fed and maintained mostly by groundwater discharge, which tends to move and come to our receiving streams at a constant rate with constant chemistry, constant temperature, a pretty stable, pristine system. When it rains on our parking lots and our roofs, of course, it does not infiltrate and become part of groundwater flow. It moves as surface runoff, and as it moves along the parking lot or the street gutter, it picks up sediment, organic materials, bacteria, heavy metals, hydrocarbons, all kinds of pollutants, and then it goes into our storm sewers, and then it goes directly to our receiving streams. And so then the other thing I talk about is how we have to be aware as we grow and add new impervious surfaces to our watersheds that we're going to generate larger volumes of runoff. And consequently, we're going to create even flashier flows in our urban streams in particular, and we're going to see spikes of pollutant loads that will be exacerbated in the future. Now, when you look at the river basin above the Cedar versus the watershed of a more localized stream like Ralston Creek, for instance, here in town, the impact of urban runoff is going to be significantly different. My analysis of the land use in the Cedar River Basin above Cedar Rapids indicated that probably less than 5% of that watershed is urbanized landscapes. 73% is row crop agriculture. So the point I make is urban runoff could not have been a major contributor to the magnitude of flooding that we saw in 2008. It contributed, of course, but it was such a small land use that it was not probably the primary concern. However, if we go to these more localized streams, in the book I cite 4 Mile Watershed in Des Moines, which drains down from the northern part of Polk County, picks up a little bit of Boone and Story County, and it comes down past Ankeny and on down through the Des Moines metro area. And 4 Mile Creek is notorious for flash flooding in East Des Moines and Pleasant Hill, and those people are looking upstream and they're seeing Ankeny urbanizing and growing at a rapid rate, and there's a new bypass highway proposed around the east part of the metro area going north to connect back up with 35, which will open the door to even more rapid growth. So those people down there that experience this flash flooding have some valid concerns about increased volumes of runoff and aggravated flood potentials, unless we start incorporating green growth concepts that mitigates the impact of adding new imperviousness to our watersheds. So with urban runoff, we're really focusing on flash floods in these smaller urbanized streams. And then in the second chapter, I talk about some of the practices that we are promoting to address water quality as well as the quantity of runoff. And how do I, oops, I didn't need to do that. But. Okay, so historically, probably not more than 10% of our annual precipitation would have moved to surface runoff, and this would have been linked primarily to snow melt or rain on frozen ground, the vast majority of rain being absorbed and infiltrated. So you see 40% unaccounted for on this slide was simply held by vegetation and evaporated in the atmosphere, or it moved into the soil but was picked up by the plants and then transpired back into the atmosphere by the process of photosynthesis. The plant essentially breathes water back into the atmosphere. But about 50% did move on downward, some to feed deep aquifers, but at least 25% of that probably becoming that groundwater flow that tended to maintain our rivers and streams in a more stable manner. Today on our urban landscapes, the majority of rain does get shed as surface runoff. We infiltrate far less, so that's my mantra: infiltrate more, shed less. What we have done with stormwater management in the past has been directed at flood control, and what we've been doing primarily is building detention basins, holes in the ground designed with so many cubic foot of storage capacity, but they are designed to manage runoff from big storms, the flood-causing events. And you're going to see in a minute that the vast majority of rainfall historically has come as small frequent rains, and this is what we do to facilitate the divestment of runoff from the small frequent storms. In this basin, they've got this little concrete channel to just move that through. So most rain that occurs will move through a detention basin as if it's not even there. And only when you get those big rains, like a 4-inch in 24-hour event and up, will they impound that water and then control the rate that we release it to prevent downstream flooding. So when you hear people talk about, well, we manage quantity because we have detention basins. No, we manage quantity we release at a point in time. We don't manage the overall quantity we release. We build more impervious surface. We do shed larger volumes. We just control the rate we release that larger volume. So here's some weather data graph. This is data from 1948 through 2004 in Sioux City and the Quad Cities. And you can see that 75 to 85% of the time when it has rained in the past, it has been a half-inch type event or less. And about 90% of the time when it has rained, it's been a 1-inch event or less. So these are the type of storms we've been targeting for the water quality aspect. We probably don't get significant flood or peak flow reductions if we infiltrate the first inch of a 7-inch rainfall event, but we certainly get water quality if 90% of the time it rains, we don't put runoff into that storm sewer, and we don't send dirty water directly to our streams. Take a lot of that flash out, a lot of that pollutant loading. But note here, where'd my arrow go? We're looking at the 3-inch rain out here. So 99% of the time plus, we don't manage runoff with detention basins because they're typically designed for those bigger storms. So what we're asking people to do is now start to merge water quality with water quantity control, and the only way to really manage quantity more sustainably is to reduce the volume of runoff. Now, if we're going to talk about infiltration-based stormwater management practices next, and we are currently designing them for this size of storm, those 1 inch and less. but there's nothing stopping us from designing them to manage a 3-inch event or the 7-inch event. And you probably have heard about the 100-year storm. We're trying to use 1% storm instead of 100-year storm nowadays. But anyhow, that 100-year storm for most of Iowa is about a 7-inch on average, about a 7-inch in 24-hour event. All right, so let's turn to some of the practices quick so I can get out of here in 10 minutes. Soil quality restoration. If we have water quality and water quantity problems, it's because there's something wrong with our landscapes and the lack or the loss of the ability to hold and retain water. And we've lost a lot of that. And in our urban landscape, we go out and we do mass grading and we push dirt around with our bulldozers and whatnot, and we compact the pore space out of the soil so that water can't move downwards and it oozes out. So we're pushing this as a lawn care practice, but also as a way to restore some hydrologic functionality to our urban landscape. So aeration, a very common turf management practice. Now we're looking at deep tined aeration, where we can punch deep holes, even 12 inches deep, and create macro pores, and then fill those up with a organic matter-rich compost. And organic matter links to the amount of rain that can be absorbed. The higher the organic matter content, the more rain gets absorbed. So that's a very simple practice that we hope will catch on, and the landscape industry can start offering soil quality restoration services and make money. Permeable pavers, this is another very important practice, and these are the three, soil quality restoration, the permeable pavement, bioretention are the three priority practices I talk about in my chapters. But pavement accounts for about, or at least transportation surfaces account for about 60 to 70% of our imperviousness. So if we can get permeable pavement to become the dominant thing, we'll eliminate a lot of runoff. And you can see sediment, floatable litter, like cigarette butts, they stay behind. The water infiltrates down into a rock chamber designed for bearing strength, but also for some water storage in the pore space between the aggregate. We want water to move out into the surrounding soils and become part of groundwater flow, but if it can't, it will go into a subdrain. So that we don't saturate this, we're ready for the next rainfall event. So here's a permeable pavement system, as well as a bioretention practice, a rain garden at a alleyscape in the downtown business district. Here is a driveway being replaced with permeable pavers next to a regular concrete drive. This one got poured last year. This one got installed a week and a half ago. So this will be a good side-by-side comparison to see how they last over time, how the costs compare over time, and what the reduction in runoff volume and pollutant load. And that's a close-up of how you can see the spacers prevent the bricks from sliding up close, and then the granular fill fills the gap. And yes, we can plow snow, bioretention or rain gardens. This is a real hot topic. We have to have good soils for these to work. If your soils won't allow water to percolate down, a rain garden won't work. It'll pond water, sit there for a long time. We want to just create that shallow basin and impound about 6 inches of water, but we want that to percolate down through the soil in about 12 hours. We want to create beautiful and hydrologically functional landscapes. And this is a site I'm very proud of. It's up on Forever Green Road. Forever Green Nursery installed it, and they're taking road runoff here. So we can do that for road runoff. We can do that for parking lot runoff. And we might have to engineer things. And by the way, this whole world of stormwater management and these new concepts is moving and changing dramatically. The recipe for the soil mix in an engineered bioretention system has changed since this book was published.
So we're already out of date, but Wayne isn't out of date at all. We're really lucky to have people like him working here in Iowa for us and for our water. Our last speaker is John Castle. John has worked for 32 years, almost a third of a century, at the Coralville Reservoir, and he's been operations project manager since 1991, which meant that he was operating the reservoir and dam during both the 1993 and 2008 floods. So he is one of the authors of 2 chapters. We have 2 chapters on the reservoir in the book, but that doesn't mean that he gets 5 minutes. He can have a whole 10 minutes. So, John.
Unlike the first 2 speakers, I don't have any PowerPoint. and that's one of the problems about talking about the reservoir. You have to use a lot of numbers, elevations, stream flows, things like that. It can get, if not confusing, boring. So I'll try and generally talk about what we try to do. The book, my chapter, is more specific to exactly what we did in 2008. I guess the simple way to think about it is like Wayne's detention basin, just a lot larger. We have no control over how much water comes down the river at us. We do have control as to how much we release from the dam of that water coming in. So most of our concern is downstream of the dam. We operate to try and mitigate things on the stream down below. One of the things I guess I need to state right off is Coralville Lake was not constructed to eliminate all flooding, which is quite clear after the last two big ones we've had. It's going to happen again at some point in the future. It was designed from basically empty to up to spillway elevation to take about 2.9 inches of runoff over the entire 3,100 square miles of watershed that drains into the Iowa River, which really is not that much when you think about it. The problem downstream is that the Iowa and the river, or the Iowa and the Cedar Rivers, come together at Columbus Junction. There are no controls on the Cedar River. So we are often affected in our operation by what's going on the Cedar River. A lot of what happened in 2008 and 93 both were because of high flows on the Cedar River. There are control points on the Iowa that we have to manage for between Iowa City or between the dam and the Mississippi River. One of them is, the first one is at Lone Tree, the next one's at Columbus Junction, the third one's at Wapello, and the fourth is at Burlington. There are limits, and they vary by time of year, whether we're during the growing season or non-growing season. But there are certain river stage elevations at those four sites that we try not to let the river exceed if we can shut down to help prevent it. Take Lone Tree, for example. This time of year, 16 feet is the limit at Lone Tree. We have to operate to try and not allow the Iowa River at Lone Tree to get above 16 feet. Majority of that effect between here and Lone Tree would be the English River. Clear Creek, Rapid Creek, several of the other creeks can affect it, but as far as a single effect, it's more the English River. If it's forecast, and the Weather Service has gotten to where they can pretty well forecast about 24 hours out. Beyond that, it's not that accurate. But they can tell us, say, what's coming down the English River, when the crest is going to hit at Lone Tree. We look at that and say, okay, we're releasing X amount of water. Can we continue to release that amount with the crest coming down the English River and still not exceed the 16 feet at Lone Tree? If that's not the case, then we look at how much we need to reduce our outflows. And we have to look at it, it's about 2 days, give or take, travel time from a change we make at the dam till it gets at Lone Tree. So we try and anticipate 2 days in advance when the crest will be at Lone Tree, how much it will be. We reduce so the timing, it gets there about the same time. Then slowly we'll open back up again to try and get as much water, particularly this time of year when the lakes fill up some, we try to drain it out as fast as possible. 93 and 2008 both, the big problem was the Cedar River. As you saw in the first set of slides, those rain events in April, plus the snowmelt in March, those were causing high flows on the Cedar. We had to shut down. We can shut down as far as the minimum is 1,000 cubic feet a second. If you've seen the river this week, we're releasing about 10,000 cubic feet a second. That's our limit for this time of year, non-growing season, unless the lake gets about 5 feet higher than it is right now. So as each one of those crests came through on the Cedar, we were shutting down. And a lot of times it doesn't make any sense. It hasn't rained here. It hasn't rained up at Marshalltown. And you'll see the river drop. It's because something's going on probably on the Cedar or the English. And it's meeting up. The Cedar and Iowa come together and flow as the Iowa all the way down to the Mississippi River. So what we do on the Iowa affects all the way down, and because we can't control anything on the Cedar, that's where it looks odd. The problem is when we shut down for flooding downstream, the lake builds up. Every time we close down, the lake continues to build up. That's what happened in 93 and 2008 both. The lake was quite high, then we got the flooding from the rainfall on top of it. There was really nowhere to put the water anymore. The lake's 52 years old. It's gone over the spillway twice. It's been close to the spillway within 3 or 4 feet, probably 8 or 9 times, if I remember right. So a number of times it's worked just like it's supposed to. It caught the spring snow melt. It caught the spring rains. It came up, didn't go over the spillway. We limited the flows to 10, maybe 11,000, went back down again. But when you get the conditions of a full lake, and then, as you saw, the amount of rainfall and the timing, too, when it all comes at one time, there's no chance to drain the lake down to get rid of some of it. Now, hopefully, we're down 2 feet already from the crest on the lake earlier this week. If we can drain down another 10, 15 feet, then if we get rains, there's room to store it. So this is all set out in a written plan that we follow. A lot of people think we just, let's crank it up today, let's shut it down tomorrow. It's not quite that simple. And just a little plug to say myself, I don't determine what those levels are. I just make them and get the phone calls. No, we have a hydraulics water control section down in our district office in the Quad Cities. And they have a bigger picture. They're looking at the Cedar and the Iowa and the Des Moines, and they're looking at what's going on the Mississippi. So they're looking at a lot more things than I would be right here. So they look at how all of these pieces fit together and then determine what our flows will be. Okay.
So, why don't we have the 3 speakers come up here, and we have time for some questions. Do we stop right at 3? If it's around 3, okay. So you can see that this whole process is more complex than one would immediately think, and the questions are not easily answered. But we'll give you a chance to challenge the speakers anyway and see if they can answer questions. So, right over here. Okay.
I have a question for John, and that is I've had a couple of friendly arguments with people who were insisting that if we dredge out the reservoir due to all the siltation that's occurred since it was constructed, that would increase our flood capacity and decrease the amount of flooding that happens during these rain events. And my argument was that that's not going to make a bit of difference unless you ever let out enough water to expose the actual level of that silt. And that the level of siltation, even though it's technically decreased the flood capacity holding of the reservoir, really wouldn't have had a bit of impact on either flood event. Is that true?
I'd say you're probably closer. If you remove it, it's going to make some difference, but any siltation we would remove from below the We actually have two levels we operate the lake at. 679 is the goal for this time of year. Then beginning the end of May, we go up to an elevation of 683. For sure, anything below 79, if you dredge out, isn't going to make any difference because the water's always there. It's either water or the silt. A lot of the silt has fallen out in the upper end of the lake, up like in the Hawkeye Wildlife Area, because the flowing water hits the lake and slows down, and that's where it drops a lot of the silt out. If a lot of that was removed up there, it probably would help. But I don't think it's really a feasible solution. First of all, we've lost 14% of the capacity to siltation since 1958. It's extremely expensive. You have to remove any of the material and put it well above any high water marks of the lake, or it'll wash right back in again. And because we're an agricultural state, Wayne maybe can speak to it, but some of it's probably a hazardous material. If we pull it out of the bottom, it would have to be treated as such. So I don't see dredging as ever really figuring in.
Never let it get there
Yeah.
in the first place, and let it erode off of the uplands.
Two related questions. The first is, could anyone say something about the effect of tile drainage in agriculture on flooding? And related to that, is there anyone who keeps track of how much tile drainage is done? How much there is now compared to, say, 25 years ago?
No.
No. Well, I can elaborate a little bit, not specifically on tiling, but just referring back to this idea of a traffic jam. So because this was a clear illustration that it does matter where and when and how much. And so now, you can take the same amount of rain and just distribute it in time differently, and then you wouldn't have the traffic jam. So with tiling, it's a similar story that sometimes it would be better to let that water go fast to not create a traffic jam. And at other times, in other places, it may be good to hold that water and say, you stay here when we let that other water, go by. So what would be, best? That's actually, difficult, to say, because that analysis would have to be very comprehensive and include the timing and amounts of rainfall, and then runoff because of the different land uses, and tires, no tires, and then take into the consideration the entire drainage network. So that's what our theory is geared towards, but there are no simple answers here. So even when Iowa was all a swamp, that doesn't mean that there were no floods. So there were floods, because now imagine that you have your nice wetland and birds and all that, and a big rain comes. So where is that water supposed to go? It has to again go to the streams and rivers, and those have limited capacity, and then you get flooding. So.
But nobody does keep track. I mean, that's usually private land, and it's that landowners in their records or not. And there's been plenty of tile that was installed that nobody really knows where it's at. I think today, you probably GPS in any tile that was installed, so you could come back to it. But in the 1900s, they didn't track that real well, and even in the 1970s, they weren't tracking that real well. But And I guess what I know my department has been interested in doing and working with the Flood Center and others is to do a true study, a hydrologic study, to try to pin down what the effect of tile drainage is on flooding, because I don't think we have that answer.
Yeah, that's right. But the answer will be, it will be scale dependent, so there may be different, answers at different, scales. So locally, why do farmers, put tiles? I mean, they know exactly what they want to achieve, and they do achieve it. But what's more difficult to then predict is the collective, effect, of that. And so.
And I might add just a little bit. Iowa was pre-settlement 25% hydric soils. We used to think it was 6% until we had these nice GIS maps. But fully a quarter of Iowa was the soils were developed in hydric conditions, which meant that they would have been defined as wetlands today. And we do know that floods occurred in pre-settlement times, but they would have been much different in character, and they would have been slow rising and slow falling, and they wouldn't have probably spread as far. Those are the two big changes, I think, that we can pin down. More questions? I think you can see from these talks that this book was a little bit more complex than one would think. I'm remembering in a painful way how complex the chapters were to kind of help put together into a book now. Go ahead.
Has there been any discussion about putting a dam north of Cedar Rapids to help to control the Cedar River?
I know the Corps hasn't. The Cedar Valley is very different than the Iowa. It's a lot wider and would be a much larger structure, and because it's wider, you'd end up flooding a lot more land with the operation of the lake. So there'd be a lot more trade-off, issues. I don't know of any lake under construction, period, right now, between environmental and political aspects. It's very unlikely.
The short answer to your question is yes, and not one, but thousands.
There you go.
So what has been discussed, but mostly informally. So there are no formal, studies, sponsored studies to do this. So what has been discussed is the concept of distributed storage. So rather than having one large reservoir, to have many of them, taking advantage of landscape configuration and little nooks in the terrain, and so forth. And to work pretty much like what Wayne discussed, but with some difference. The effectiveness of this concept would be increased if these storages were fully controlled. So allowing for that traffic, control in the drainage network that I was referring to. But there are a number of very major difficulties with this concept. So some just on the scientific level, because before you would promote something like this, you really need to study this, and what that means is that you have to have good understanding of that water transport at the level of those details of individual small storages. Then you have to operate them. And then the question would be, so you have to operate them based on the forecast. It wouldn't be that easy to develop those operating rules that are in place for the large, reservoirs. And so then you would have to rely on the forecasts. And again, weather forecasts are far from perfect, right? So, and then another difficulty would be, socio-political, because first you have to have agreement from the landowners to put such, storages with monitoring equipment and automated, gates.
but then you have to convince them that somebody, and I don't know what organization would that be, that somebody is operating, that whole system in a way to benefit. And then the question is whom? Cedar Rapids, or everybody else, or people downstream from Cedar Rapids, and so there are many difficulties, with this. We would love to study this problem through Iowa Flood Center, but again, the difficult nature of the problem calls for substantial funding, and we don't know who might fund this.
And I just want to add one point. When you build structures, you are dealing with runoff after it's already moving. And so simultaneously, we must increase the landscape's ability to retain water and generate less runoff. And if we don't do that, I don't think we ever succeed.
And I'm sorry to say that will be the end of our questions. I think that the panelists will be here for a while if you'd like to ask more questions. And I will end with a phrase that I hear a lot in my halls nowadays, which is learning to live with floods. And I think that one of the chapters in the book discusses climate change and the distinct probability that we'll be having more extreme weather events in the spring and early summer. So this is something that we're going to need to learn to deal with in multiple ways, such as those that our panelists talked about today. So let's give them one more round of thanks. And thank you all for coming on this beautiful afternoon.